Welcome to Little Known Black History Facts. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Bass Reeves, the original Lone Ranger of the West. Usually, when a black man was portrayed in movies and television shows about the Old West, people conjured up images of dusty towns, quick-drawing gunmen, cowboys, villains in black hats, and heroes in white. Indigenous Native Americans were always the bad guys, and all the white women were either saints or sinners. If there was a black man, chances are he was holding the horse of the courageous and very white sheriff. The iconic television figure of the 1950s, the Lone Ranger, was portrayed as a white hero, but in reality, the original Lone Ranger was not white. The real Lone Ranger, it turns out, was based on an African-American man named Bass Reeves, the first black Deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi River. Reeves worked mostly in Arkansas and the Oklahoma Indian Territory. Although Reeves the man is mostly unrecognizable in much of the Lone Ranger legend, some of the basic aspects remain intact. Both were lawmen hunting bad guys, both were accompanied by a Native American, both rode a white horse, and both gave away a silver trademark to people they encountered. Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves is where the fictional West gives way to the actual West. Bass Reeves' West was a lot more diverse in reality than was shown on film. Reeves was one of several African-American Deputy U.S. Marshals who rode the trails of the Indian Territory that would eventually become Oklahoma. Reeves was a slave born in Arkansas, but rose to the status of a living legend during the 30-plus years wearing a Marshal star, most of that served as a manhunter for the hanging judge Isaac C. Parker of Fort Smith. Reeves' hire was highly prized because he knew the Indian Territory and could speak several Indian languages. Reeves had a reputation for going after the baddest of the bad. He was a giant for his day, standing at 6 feet 2 inches tall. He was a skilled horseman and a master of disguise. Reeves mostly rode a white horse throughout his career. He arrested more than 3,000 men, including his own son, and killed more than a dozen in the line of duty. Reeves was an expert with pistol and rifle and could shoot using both his right or left hand. Research shows that he could shoot accurately with his Winchester rifle up to 500 yards or a quarter of a mile, and that he had several gunfights during which he shot felons from that distance. While Jim Crow and a general apathy about the history of non-whites worked to try to make sure Reeves' legend was never known in the modern day, his story has been resurrected and is probably one of the greatest Old West legends you've probably never heard. African Americans were pretty much written out of that whole history, but if we look at the real Western frontier, we find that blacks were mountain men, black scouts, black entrepreneurs, and numerous black cowboys. Blacks were in law enforcement all across the West, in Montana, Colorado, and New Mexico. 20% of the military on the Western frontier were African Americans. So Hollywood just totally left out African Americans in the telling of the story of the West. In the late 1870s, although Reeves was a U.S. Deputy Marshal, much of his work was as a posse man for other Deputy U.S. Marshals. Reeves became known in the early 1880s for bringing prisoners back to the Fort Smith court in double digits. Bass Reeves was a master of disguises. He often used these disguises to track down outlaws by dressing similarly and adopting their mannerisms to infiltrate the fugitive gangs, ultimately to identify and arrest them. Reeves always carried and often gave out silver coins as a personal trademark or calling card of sorts. Reeves handed out these valuable coins with a dual purpose: to ingratiate himself to the townspeople, and as a future incentive for information needed while collecting bounties. Bass had a reputation throughout the territory for his ability to catch outlaws that other deputies couldn't. Bass continued to serve as a U.S. Marshal in the Indian Territory until 1893. At the age of 67, Bass Reeves retired from federal service when Oklahoma gained statehood in 1907. As an African American, Bass was unable to continue in his position as Deputy Marshal under the new state laws. He was hired as a city policeman in Muskogee, Oklahoma, where he served for about 2 years until his death in 1910 at age 71. Reeves had worked for 32 years as a federal peace officer in the Indian Territory, and during his career he brought in some of the most dangerous criminals of the time, but he was never wounded despite having his hat and belt shot off in several occasions. Being a former slave, Reeves was illiterate but would memorize his warrants. In those 32 years, it was said that he never arrested the wrong person due to the fact that he couldn't read. Although there is no concrete evidence that the real legend inspired the creation of one of fiction's most well-known cowboys, Bass Reeves is the closest real person to resemble the fictional Lone Ranger on the American western frontier of the 19th century. Bass Reeves accomplished many things that dwarf tales of his fictional counterpart, from his journey as an enslaved man to becoming one of the staunchest defenders of the very government that failed to protect his freedom in the first place. The story of Bass Reeves remains an inspiration for real-life heroes to this day. Until next time, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Press the bell to be notified of future uploads. Thank you for watching.